Hello and welcome to this tutorial on selecting child game objects from the parent transform and manipulating the components of this child game object. In this case, the component is a renderer and we are changing the material of the renderer in randomly or orderly by the parent's children. This is a continuation of surround spam series, but you will be also able to use the code for a standalone project, and I will be showing you how you can do that after I show you how the code works. Here we are starting with our surround spam behavior. Here are surround spammer, here are rotator from the second video, and the last video we have random highlight. In this we are giving references of two materials, one for highlight and one for normal state of the game object, and we have a highlight mode. It's an enumerable. We can either highlight game objects under the parent's transform randomly or in order. And in order, it means that we will be incrementing which game object we are highlighting in order of the game object that is under the parent transform. So this was how the behavior works. Let's go and check out the code. Here is our random highlight code. We start with a declaration of an enum variable called switch highlight mode, and the highlight mode could be a random or in order mode. And after we went through our enum variable, let's go and start going through our behavior. Here you see our public variables that we just went through earlier. Highlight on material is set to game object that is highlighted, and highlight of material set to other game objects that are not highlighted. We have a highlight mode that we set through the editor, but you can also set it from here. And now we are moving on to our private variables. We have a list of renderers called switches, and we have an integer switch count that is the count of game objects that is under our parent transform, also the count of renderers in switches list. We have an ID variable that's called current highlighted switch ID, and this is the ID of game object that we currently highlighting. At default it is set to 0. Even though we do not do that, it will be set to 0, so it's a random action, but let's make it safe. And lastly we have a duration variable, next highlight duration. It is the duration between the highlighted game object changes. After this duration passes, we will be selecting a new game object to highlight. This behavior starts with its action by the call of setSwitches function. This function takes a reference of the parent game object and fills the target component of the child game objects to the switches list. In this case, switches list consists of renderers, so we will be storing the renderer components of each child in the switch parent transform. And where we call this in surround spam project is in the center surround behavior after we spam all the surrounding game objects. The owner of center surrounder also has the random highlight behavior, so we are referencing the random highlight behavior with the get component method, and we are calling setSwitches function by feeding its variable to surround parent transform that holds all the newly created game object. And going back to our random highlight with setSwitches function, first we initiate the list and then we set the switch count as the child count of the parent game object. After that we start our for loop to fill up the switches render list by going through each child of switch parent and getting the renderer component of that child game object and inserting it to switches list. And how we go through each child of the parent game object is we are using getChild method with indexing, and the indexes in a transform goes through 0 to child count -1, and by limiting our for loop this way, we will go up maximum to switch count -1, which is what we are targeting. After that we added the renderer. Now it has a place in our switches list and we can directly access it from its index. And since we are initiating our switches, we will be closing this highlight. To close this highlight, we are setting the renderer's material to highlight of material. After each renderer component added to switches list and initiated as a highlight of state, after that we are ready to change the highlights of target game objects. I am directly calling the change the highlight switch function here, which highlights the next game object regarding our highlight mode, but doing so we are directly highlighting a game object after we initiated them, so we start to see them by one is highlighted. You can change that by calling the function with an invoke method or starting a coroutine and at the start waiting for some duration, then highlighting the next game object. Here is our change the highlighted switch function, and at the start we highlight off currently highlighted game object by getting it by its index, which is currently highlighted switch ID, and setting it as material to highlight of material. We close down the previously open switch, highlighted switch. We are moving on with highlight mode so that we will be selecting the next switch ID. If our behavior is in order mode, we calculate the currently highlighted switch ID as incremented by 1. And we want the behavior to loop through the game objects, so we are using modulo operator here with the switch count value. By doing so, when currently highlighted switch ID value overflows the switch count, it will return to 0th index and it will create a loop. If the mode is random, we directly choose a random value between 0 and switch count -1. Because we are using random range in integer setting, minimum value is inclusive but maximum value is exclusive, so switch count -1 comes from there. And lastly, we highlight the newly selected current highlighted switch ID game object by setting it as material, so highlight on material. After that, you can call this function with the invoke method after some next highlight duration, that is in our case 0.8 seconds, and continue calling that way. Or you can use again an invoke function and have a random duration between next minimum duration and next maximum duration that you determine the values and call that. Or you can use coroutines, or you can use other logics that you prefer to be using, and you can continue calling this function. If you don't want to call this function again and you only need one highlight game object, just get rid of the invoke value and maybe have the currently highlighted switch ID as a public variable and use that for referencing it from other behaviors. And lastly, I want to say that in this behavior we are storing renderer components of child game objects. But you can store other components and change the values of these components as a highlight behavior, such as you can use audio sources and play and stop them, and also start them playing from where the other game object stopped, kind of logic. You will be able to mold this logic into other components, but this time you will not be setting materials but maybe playing and stopping an audio source. And this is how we can use the behavior. Let's go back and see it one more time and create one example that is independable from surround spawn project. Here I am getting rid of surround spawn thingies in the scene, and now I will be creating an empty game object and creating some child game object under it is transform. So one sphere and one cube I have here, and I am duplicating them with Ctrl D and moving them again, and duplicating them, Ctrl D, moving them again. Now my game object is ready. Let me put it so that we will be seeing them also in the game scene better way. So my parent object is game object here. I am adding my random highlight behavior to this game object, setting highlight on material as the on material, setting off material as the off material, and highlight mode to be random. When I hit the play, nothing will happen because we haven't uncommented this line of code that will start the random highlight behavior. Here I am setting switch parent as the owner of this behavior's transform, and from there it will be storing its child game objects, renderers, and set the values according to them. Now I'm hitting play again and everything is working, and the child game objects are highlighted randomly. Here is something we were expecting. If I were to say highlight them in order, now they are being highlighted in order. But there is one important point here that you should be careful about. The order in the hierarchy is also the order that you want them to be highlighted if you selecting the order, not for highlight. So this was it for the end of this video and also the surround spawn project. If you like this one, like the video and also subscribe to the channel for new videos to come. The new ones will be similar to this ones. Whether the behavior will be connected to a series, I will be showing you a standalone usage for the newly created behavior. If you're interested in that simple, but for logics, for game development, I suggest subscribing to this channel. And this is it for now. I hope to see you in the next explorations, and bye bye.